Have you ever been told that your entire life was already decided before you were old enough to have an opinion about it? Not in a vague parental guidance kind of way. I mean literally mapped out. School, career, social circle, and yes, the man you would one day marry. That was my reality growing up as Natalie Pendleton, the only daughter of Dominic Pendleton, one of the most powerful commercial real estate developers in Seattle, Washington. My father did not just build skyscrapers. He built reputations, dismantled careers, and collected powerful people the way other men collected expensive watches. To him, everything in life had an appraised value: properties, partnerships, and people. And for 28 years, I was the most carefully managed asset in his portfolio. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. My father is not a villain in the cinematic sense. He never raised his hand, never screamed across a dinner table, never did anything the outside world could point to and call cruelty. What he did was quieter and far more suffocating than that. He made you feel, in every subtle and deliberate interaction, that your worth as a person was entirely conditional. Conditional on your grades, your appearance, your obedience, and most critically, your usefulness to the Pendleton name. Approval in our household was the only currency that mattered, and I had spent my entire childhood and most of my adult life trying to earn just enough of it to feel like I was allowed to take up space. My name is Natalie. I am 29 years old. And if you are watching this right now and you have ever felt like a supporting character in your own story, I need you to stay with me because what happened to me over the last 14 months changed everything I thought I understood about family, love, and what it actually means to belong to yourself. Before I go any further, if you are new here, please subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the Tuesday evening in October that started a war I did not yet know I was already standing in the middle of. The Pendleton home on Queen and Hill is the kind of house that appears in architecture magazines with captions about clean lines and intentional living. Floor-to-ceiling windows that frame the Seattle skyline like a painting someone commissioned specifically to remind guests how well things had gone for the man who owned it. That evening the table was set for three as it always was. My mother Sandra sat at the far end, quietly working through her food with the focused attention of someone who has perfected the art of being present without being involved. She had a talent for that, my mother. She could sit in the middle of a demolition and somehow make it look like she was simply having dinner. My father poured himself a Bordeaux and informed me without any particular preamble that he had arranged for me to meet someone. Connor Aldrich, the son of his longest-standing business partner, a man whose company my father had been circling for a merger for 3 years. He described Connor the way you would describe a property with strong fundamentals. Solid background, right connections, appropriate family. He used the word suitable 3 times in under 2 minutes and I counted every single one. I set down my fork and told him I was already seeing someone. The silence that settled over the table had a texture to it. My father placed his wine glass down with the measured calm of a man who considers visible surprise to be a form of weakness. Pass me the name. I said Ethan. He asked the family. I told him he would not know them. He asked what Ethan did. I told him he ran a contracting business out of Georgetown. My father picked up his glass, finished his wine, set it back down and said nothing else for the remainder of the meal. That silence was not neutrality. That silence was a decision. I would understand its full meaning very soon. I had met Ethan Merritt 7 months earlier on a Saturday that was never supposed to matter. I had spent the morning at one of my father's signature social events, a brunch on Mercer Island that was dressed up as casual but was in reality a networking exercise with better food. I had performed well, smiled correctly, said all the right things to all the right people, and then I had gotten in my car and driven to the Capitol Hill Farmers Market because I needed 60 unscheduled minutes where nobody knew my last name. Ethan was standing at a reclaimed wood furniture stall, not browsing idly but actually studying a side table with the quiet intensity of someone who understood how it had been made. He was tall, wearing a plain gray Henley, and there was a faint smear of something near his left cuff that looked like it might have been paint or wood stain. He had dark eyes and a stillness about him that felt rare and slightly foreign in a city full of people performing their own ambition. I said something about the dovetail joints on the table, a detail I had noticed from my own brief woodworking phase in college, and he looked up and smiled and said he had been trying to work out how the craftsman had avoided burning the edges during finishing. We stood at that stall for 40 minutes talking about nothing that mattered and somehow everything that did. He asked about my week with the genuine curiosity of someone who actually wanted to know. He did not ask about my family name or my father's company or where I lived. When I mentioned I worked in marketing at a development firm, he nodded and asked if I found it interesting. No one had ever asked me that question. Not my colleagues, not my father's friends, not the men my father had previously positioned near me at carefully arranged dinners. Not once. We had coffee that Thursday at a small roastery in Eastlake that Ethan liked because the owner had been doing the same thing the same way for over 20 years with no apparent desire to scale. He paid in cash from a worn leather wallet and talked about his work with the understated ease of someone who did not need external validation to feel certain of what they had built. He described it simply. Contracting work. Project management. A bit of everything. He was deliberately vague in a way I noticed and filed away but did not pursue because the rest of him felt so straightforward and so genuine that I gave him the benefit of something I rarely extended to anyone. I gave him my trust. What I did not understand at the time and would not understand until I was standing in a room surrounded by people who clearly knew exactly who my husband was that the phrase contracting work was a very small door covering a very large room. My father's investigator had found a clean and unremarkable paper trail because it had been designed to be exactly that. Ethan Merritt had built something significant and had spent considerable energy making sure it did not announce itself. Within a week of that October dinner, my father summoned me to his office on the 41st floor of the Columbia Center. Corner suite, full view of Elliott Bay, the kind of room where the architecture alone is meant to remind you of the power differential before anyone says a word. There was a manila folder on the desk. He slid it toward me without expression. Ethan Daniel Merritt, 34 years old. Georgetown address. Merritt Contracting LC, modest revenue filings, leased workspace, no notable assets, no significant holdings, no family connections worth recording. My father looked at me across the desk with something I can only describe as measured disappointment. This is who you are choosing, he said. I told him Ethan was a good man. My father told me good was the most ordinary thing a person could be. I left the folder on his desk and walked out. The elevator doors closed before he finished saying my name. He believed he had seen everything there was to see. He had no idea that the most important part of the story had not even been written yet. That night I called Ethan from the parking garage beneath the Columbia Center, still in my work clothes, hands not quite steady. I told him what my father had said and what he had found and what he had called him. Ethan was quiet on the other end for a long moment. Then he said, "Does it change anything for you?" I told him no. He said, "Then it does not matter." There was a certainty in his voice that I could not explain at the time, the kind of certainty that comes not from arrogance but from a person who knows something you do not yet know. I did not press him on it. But lying awake that night in my apartment in Capitol Hill, staring at the ceiling while the rain came down against the windows the way it only does in Seattle, I thought about that steadiness in his voice and I wondered what exactly he was so certain about. I would find out. Just not yet. 2 days later my father made his opening move. Not a conversation, not a warning. An action. I arrived at my desk at Pendleton Developments on a Thursday morning to find a meeting request from HR already sitting in my inbox, sent at 6:47 in the morning before most people had even arrived. Subject line, role restructuring discussion. My direct supervisor, a woman named Patricia who had always been careful to be kind to me in the specific way people are kind to someone whose father owns the building, would not meet my eyes in the hallway. By 11 that morning I had been formally informed that my marketing role was being absorbed into a restructured department and that my last day would be in 3 weeks. My father had not even waited a week. He had gone straight to the thing he knew would hurt the most, not the money, not the social pressure, but my sense of competence. My sense that I had earned something on my own terms. He wanted me to feel small before I had even made a decision. That was how Dominic Pendleton operated. He did not wait for you to fall. He removed the ground. The thing about losing your job at your father's company is that it does not feel like a layoff. It feels like a declaration. There was no severance negotiation, no exit interview with any real substance, no colleague who pulled me aside afterward to say they were sorry and meant it. Patricia handed me a standard separation agreement across a conference room table on a Friday afternoon, and the entire interaction lasted 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall the entire time, focusing on the second hand because it was the only thing in the room that was moving honestly. I signed the agreement, cleared my desk into a single cardboard box, and walked through the open plan office toward the elevator while 23 people I had worked alongside for 3 years suddenly found reasons to look at their screens. One woman, Dana from the events team, gave me a small tight smile as I passed. That smile was the most human thing that happened to me that entire day. I pressed the lobby button in the elevator and stood there holding my cardboard box and thought, so this is what the opening move looks like. Ethan picked me up from the Columbia Center lobby without being asked. I had not called him. He had texted 20 minutes earlier simply saying he was nearby if I needed a ride, as though he had somehow known. We drove south through the city without talking much and ended up parked near the waterfront at Myrtle Edwards Park. The Olympic Mountains sitting across the sound in the late afternoon light like they were completely indifferent to everything happening in my life, which honestly I found comforting. He bought 2 coffees from a cart near the path and we sat on a bench and I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, without offering solutions, without once telling me it was going to be fine. He just listened. I did not realize until that moment how rarely anyone had ever just done that for me. The social erosion started the following week and it was swift in the way that only truly coordinated things can be swift. My phone did not go silent all at once. It went quiet in stages like lights being turned off in a building room by room. First the group chats slowed down, then the individual check-ins stopped and then came the messages. Always careful, always wrapped in the language of regret. One came from a woman I had known since we were 14, a girl I had sat beside at every school formal, every summer party, every birthday dinner for over a decade. She wrote that she was so sorry but her family had significant contracts with Pendleton Developments and she could not afford the complications right now. He hoped I understood. She signed it with 3 X's and a heart. I stared at that heart for a long time. Another message came from a man named Brett who had been in my professional circle for years. Someone I had genuinely considered a friend rather than just a contact. He was more direct than most. He wrote that word had gotten around and that he wished me luck but needed to protect his positioning. His positioning. I saved that one too, not out of bitterness but because I wanted to remember clearly what I was dealing with. These were not friendships. They were arrangements with better lighting. Within 2 weeks my phone had reduced itself to Ethan, my grandmother's old attorney whose calls I kept delaying, and my younger brother Ryan, who texted me a single message that read, "Heard what happened, that's cold, call me if you need to talk." Ryan and I had never been particularly close, kept at a distance by my father's habit of managing all his relationships separately and strategically, but that text landed differently than anything else I received that week. I did not call him, but I saved the message. Ethan and I had been together for 8 months when he proposed. It was a Sunday morning in November, gray outside the way Seattle is gray in November, which is completely and without apology. We were in his apartment in Georgetown, a converted industrial space on the ground floor of a building that from the outside looked like it stored equipment and from the inside was warm and considered and full of things he had made or repaired with his own hands. He made breakfast, eggs and toast and strong coffee, and then he slid a small box across the kitchen table while I was mid-sentence about something entirely unrelated. Inside was a ring. A single oval stone on a slim gold band, understated and exact, the kind of thing that took genuine attention to choose. He did not get down on one knee. He sat across from me at his kitchen table and said, "I am not going to pretend I can predict what your family is going to do next. I know this is not the uncomplicated version of this. But I want to build my life with you and I am asking if you want that too." I said yes before he had fully finished the sentence. I had known my answer for months. That evening I called my mother. I told her we were getting married in 3 months and that I wanted her to hear it from me before anyone else. The silence on her end stretched long enough that I checked my screen to see if the call had dropped. Then she exhaled and said, "Natalie, your father is going to see this as a direct challenge." I told her it was not a challenge, it was a decision. She said, "In this family there is no difference." She asked me to think about what I was giving up. I told her I was thinking about what I was choosing. She said she would pray for me and then she ended the call, which was her version of hanging up on someone while maintaining plausible deniability. My brother Ryan called the next morning. I had expected another brief text. Instead he called and stayed on the phone for 40 minutes, the longest conversation we had ever had as adults. He was cautious, practical, not cruel. He said, "Look, I am not going to tell you what to do, but Dad is already talking to his lawyers." I asked what kind of lawyers. He went quiet for a moment and said the estate kind. I thanked him and hung up and sat with that information for the rest of the afternoon. My father's formal response came 8 days later. Not a phone call, not a visit. A letter. Delivered by courier to my Capitol Hill apartment on a Wednesday morning, on Pendleton Development's letterhead, drafted by his personal attorney. It was 2 paragraphs. The first stated that effective immediately I was being removed as an authorized signatory on all family accounts and that my access to the Pendleton Family Trust was under formal review pending a change in circumstances. The second paragraph noted that the family property in Sun Valley that had been designated for my use was being returned to the estate. It was signed by the attorney, not my father. He had not even put his name on it. I read it twice, set it on my kitchen counter and called Ethan. He came over that evening with groceries and made dinner without making the letter the centerpiece of the conversation, which was exactly the right thing to do. Later, when we were sitting on my couch and the dishes were done and the letter was still sitting on the counter, he looked at it and said, "He is trying to make you feel like you need him to survive." I said, "I know." Ethan said, "Do you believe him?" I thought about that for a long time before I answered. I said, "I am working on not believing him." He nodded like that was a completely acceptable place to be. The weeks between the letter and our wedding were an education in exactly how deep my father's reach went. I had started applying for marketing roles across Seattle, positions at agencies and mid-size companies where I thought my experience would speak clearly enough on its own. The rejections came back faster than they should have. 2 companies I spoke to had done work with Pendleton developments within the last 18 months. One hiring manager, a woman I had a phone screen with, was perfectly warm and then called back 24 hours later to say the role had been filled internally. The role was reposted 3 weeks later. I did not bother applying again. What was strange, and what I kept returning to in the quiet parts of those weeks, was Ethan's composure through all of it. Not the composure of someone who was numb or detached, but the composure of someone who was not particularly worried. There was a night in late November when I woke at 2 in the morning to find his side of the bed empty. I found him in the kitchen, standing at the counter with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in a low and focused voice. I caught fragments before he noticed me. Something about a valuation window and a decision that needed to come before the end of the quarter. He saw me in the doorway, said he would follow up in the morning and set the phone down. Contract stuff, he said simply. Deadline pressure. Come back to bed. I went back to bed. But I lay there in the dark thinking about the particular vocabulary of that sentence. Valuation window was not language that belonged to a small contracting operation. It was language that belonged to something else entirely. I filed it away alongside the cash, alongside the careful vagueness, alongside the older man who had shown up twice now at places I had not expected him to be, always greeting Ethan with the kind of quiet deference that people reserve for someone above them on an organizational chart they would rather not name out loud. The pieces were accumulating. I was not yet ready to see what they formed. But the picture was beginning to take shape whether I was ready or not. 3 weeks before our wedding, my father came to my apartment. No advance notice, no text, no call. I opened the door to find him standing in my hallway in a charcoal overcoat, looking at my modest Capitol Hill apartment with the careful neutral expression of a man performing the act of not being appalled. He told me he wanted to talk. I let him in because I was still, despite everything, his daughter. He sat on my couch like he was doing it a favor. That was the thing about Dominic Pendleton in unfamiliar spaces. He did not adjust to rooms. He assessed them. He looked at my bookshelves, my second-hand coffee table, the small print I had hung above the fireplace, and I could see him running numbers in his head the way he always did, calculating value, finding it insufficient. My apartment was not impressive by his standards and he made no effort to pretend otherwise. He declined the coffee I offered and got to the point with the efficiency of a man who bills his time by the hour even when he is not in the office. He told me he was prepared to be reasonable. That was the word he used. Reasonable. He said he understood that I was at an age where independence felt important and that he respected that in principle. Then he set a number on the table. Not literally, he did not bring a checkbook this time, but he stated it plainly. He would reinstate my access to the family trust, restore my position at Pendleton Developments with a title upgrade, and add my name back to the Sun Valley property, if I postponed the wedding by 1 year. Not cancelled. Postponed. He framed it as generosity. A cooling-off period. Time to be certain. I asked him if he had come here to negotiate with me about my own marriage. He said he had come to protect me from a mistake. I asked him what specifically about Ethan concerned him beyond the contents of that folder, beyond the Georgetown address and the modest revenue filings. He said, "Natalie, a man who has nothing to show for himself by 34 has already told you everything you need to know about his ceiling." I thought about Ethan at that kitchen table sliding a ring across to me without ceremony or performance, asking simply if I wanted to build a life with him. I thought about the valuation window and the late-night phone calls and the older man with the careful deference. I thought about how certain Ethan always sounded. I told my father no. He stood, buttoned his coat, and told me I was making the most expensive decision of my life. I told him I hoped so. He left without saying goodbye. I stood at my window and watched his car pull away from the curb and felt something settle in my chest that I had not felt in years. Not relief exactly. More like clarity. The negotiation was over. Whatever came next would not be about convincing each other. It would just be consequences. Our wedding was never supposed to be large. Ethan and I had planned something deliberate and small. 40 guests at a restored event space in Pioneer Square. Exposed brick and warm light, and a dinner that felt like an actual dinner rather than a catered performance. People we genuinely wanted in the room. His side included friends from Georgetown, a few people from industries I did not yet fully understand, and the older silver-haired man I had seen twice before, whose name I learned was Wallace and who smiled at me during the ceremony with the particular warmth of someone who already knew how the story ended. My side was smaller than it should have been. Dana from the events team came. My brother Ryan sat in the third row and looked uncomfortable in his suit in the way younger brothers always do. What I had not anticipated was my father's version of a wedding gift. We arrived at Pioneer Square to find that the catering staff had been replaced. The original team had received a call that morning informing them the event had been cancelled and that a new vendor would be handling the evening. The new vendor had been booked by my father and came with a guest list he had curated himself. By the time Ethan and I walked through the door, there were over 150 additional people in that room. Faces from my father's world, business partners and their spouses, board members, a city councilman my father played golf with, 2 people I recognized from the society pages of Seattle magazine. My mother was seated in the front row in a dove gray dress she had clearly purchased for this occasion. My father stood near the bar in a charcoal suit, champagne in hand, wearing the expression of a man who had just successfully reframed someone else's event as his own. He kissed my cheek before I could step back and said he would not miss his daughter's wedding for anything in the world. The way he said daughter, warm and proprietorial for the audience around him, made my skin crawl. Ethan stood beside me and said nothing. His jaw was set and his eyes were steady, and he put his hand on the small of my back with the calm of a person who has already decided how this evening is going to go regardless of what the next few hours bring. The ceremony itself was ours. Our officiant, a friend of Ethan's named Carol who had known him for years in a context I still did not fully understand, kept the room grounded. Ethan's vows were plain and direct and completely without performance. He said he had spent years building things that lasted and that I was the most important thing he had ever decided to build toward. He said he did not need me to need him. He just wanted to be the person I chose. I cried through most of my own vows and did not care who was watching. We were married. For about 4 minutes it was exactly what we had planned. Then my father's glass met the side of a champagne flute and the room shifted. He moved to the center of the space with the ease of a man who has given 1,000 toasts and enjoyed every single one. He welcomed the room, thanked the guests he had invited as though he had organized the evening, and then turned toward our table with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He said he had built Pendleton Developments from a single property lease into one of the most respected development firms in the Pacific Northwest, and that he had done it by understanding one fundamental truth: that the company you keep determines the life you live. He let that land. Then he turned to look at Ethan with the particular brand of contempt that powerful men deploy when they want to humiliate someone without appearing to lose composure. He said his daughter had chosen to marry a man whose entire professional history amounted to a small contracting operation with no significant assets, no industry standing, and no trajectory worth noting. He said it the way you would read a disappointing quarterly report. Measured. Final. He announced that effective that day I was being formally removed from his will. That my designation as a beneficiary of the Pendleton Family Trust was permanently revoked. He said the number out loud. The full estimated value of what I had walked away from. He said it for the room, not for me. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the people in those chairs to carry the story back into the city and make sure everyone understood the cost of my choice. He raised his glass and said to my daughter, "May she find what she is looking for." The room was silent in the way rooms get when something has gone too far and everyone knows it but no one wants to be the first to move. Ethan stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform anger or reach for drama. He straightened his jacket, looked at my father across the room and said, "Thank you for coming, Dominic. I know it was not easy to walk into someone else's celebration and make it about yourself. That takes a particular kind of commitment." Quiet laughter moved through the room, startled and genuine. My father's smile tightened. Ethan continued. He said that my father had spent the evening telling a room full of people what I had given up, but that he had missed the more interesting question, which was what I had chosen. He said he understood that a man who measured everything by its appraised value would struggle to understand a decision made entirely outside that framework. He looked at my father without hostility, with something closer to patience, and said, "The things worth keeping rarely come with a listing price." Then he turned to me, offered his hand, and I took it. I stood and faced the room. I looked out at the people my father had brought to witness my humiliation, and I said that I had spent most of my life trying to meet a standard designed not to be met, because a standard you can meet stops being useful as a leash. I said I was done. I looked at Ethan beside me and said I was exactly where I was supposed to be, and for the first time in 29 years I was completely certain of it. About 30 of my father's guests left. The rest stayed. My father left with my mother without saying goodbye, and the door had barely closed before the room became something warm and real and entirely ours. Ethan wiped frosting off my cheek 2 hours later and asked if I was all right. I told him I was better than all right. He smiled that quiet smile and said, "Good. Because the next part is going to be interesting." I asked what he meant. He kissed my forehead instead of answering. I was beginning to understand that this was his way of telling me something was coming. I just did not yet know what it would cost my father when it arrived. The days immediately after our wedding had a strange suspended quality to them. We had moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Fremont, north of the Ship Canal, with tall windows that looked out over the neighborhood rooftops and enough morning light to make the modest square footage feel larger than it was. It was nothing like the Pendleton home on Queen and Hill. There was no view of the skyline, no imported stone countertops, no silent housekeeper who appeared and disappeared without acknowledgement. What there was ours. Every second-hand chair and mismatched mug and slightly uneven kitchen shelf was something we had chosen together, and that felt like a form of wealth I had not previously had access to. The job rejections had become so predictable that I stopped reading them fully. I would open the email, scan the first line, and close it. "Thank you for your interest. We have decided to move forward with other candidates. We will keep your resume on file." That last part was always the most insulting. The idea that somewhere in a server room my name was sitting in a folder marked future consideration when we both knew the folder was never going to be opened again. 6 weeks after the wedding, I had applied to 22 marketing positions across Seattle and received 22 rejections. Some came back within hours, which told me the decision had been made before anyone had looked at my work. I knew what was happening. I had watched my father operate for long enough to recognize the shape of his influence even when I could not see the mechanism directly. He did not need to make phone calls himself. He simply existed at the center of a web of professional relationships and obligations dense enough that a word in the right ear, or sometimes no word at all, just the knowledge of his position on something, was sufficient to close a door. I was not being blacklisted in any formal sense. I was just becoming a liability that no one in his orbit wanted to absorb. Ethan never pushed me to let him help. That was the thing I kept returning to during those weeks. He had resources I did not fully understand yet, connections that clearly extended far beyond what a contracting operation in Georgetown would logically produce, and he never once leveraged any of it on my behalf without my asking. He understood, without my having to explain it, that the only version of rebuilding that would mean anything to me was the one I built myself. He brought home groceries and cooked dinner and asked about my day with genuine interest, and when I got frustrated and said things like maybe my father was right, maybe I had no idea how to survive without the Pendleton infrastructure propping me up, Ethan would wait until I finished and then say, "You are not describing a ceiling. You are describing the first few weeks of starting over. There is a difference." He was steady in a way that should have felt too good to be true, and I kept waiting for the moment it would crack. It did not crack. There was a morning in late January, about 5 weeks after the wedding, when I was sitting at our kitchen table in Fremont with my laptop open and a cup of coffee going cold beside me, and I was not looking at job listings. I was looking at a blank document. I had been sitting there for 40 minutes and the document was still blank, and I was thinking about a conversation I had years earlier with a woman who ran a small brand consultancy out of Portland. She had told me that the most useful thing about being trained inside a large organization was that you learned exactly what the large organization was too slow and too afraid to do. I had filed that away at the time without knowing why. That morning in January I took it back out. I opened a new tab and started writing. Not a cover letter. A business outline. Small, specific, no infrastructure, no overhead, just me and whatever I actually knew how to do. Brand positioning and content strategy for businesses that did not have marketing departments because they were still too new or too lean to justify one. The kind of work that the big agencies considered too small to bother with and that small businesses desperately needed and could not afford at agency rates. I wrote for 3 hours, and when Ethan came home that evening I showed him the document. He read it carefully, asked 2 precise questions about the revenue model, and then looked up and said, "This is good. When are you starting?" I told him I had no clients, no office, no incorporated entity, and roughly enough savings to last another 2 months at our current expenses. He nodded and said, "So the answer is soon then." I laughed despite myself. That was the moment the business became a real intention rather than a coping mechanism. 2 weeks later I received a phone call from a woman named Helen Baird. She introduced herself as the attorney for my grandmother's estate, my father's mother, Eleanor Pendleton, who had passed away 14 months earlier. I had loved my grandmother with a completeness I had rarely felt for anyone else in my family. She was sharp and funny and had the specific quality of actually listening when you spoke, which in the Pendleton family was rarer than any of the imported furniture. I had grieved her in the way you grieve someone who was the one safe place inside a complicated landscape. Helen Baird told me that my grandmother had left instructions that a particular communication be delivered to me only after I had married someone of my own choosing, independent of family approval. The phrasing, Helen explained, had been very deliberate. Independent of family approval. My grandmother had known her son well enough to write the condition into the legal language. Helen asked if I could come to her office. The office was in Bellevue, quiet and book-lined in the way of old professional spaces that have never needed to be impressive because the work speaks adequately for itself. Helen slid a sealed envelope across her desk and then a second document, a trust instrument for pages, dense with the formal language of estate law. She gave me a moment to read the summary. My grandmother had established a separate trust, independently administered, outside of anything connected to Dominic Pendleton or Pendleton Developments, funded with assets she had accumulated and managed entirely on her own over the course of 40 years. The trust had been designated for me. It had a value of just under $400,000 in diversified holdings, liquid within 30 days of the triggering condition being met. The triggering condition had been met the day I married Ethan. I opened the envelope after Helen stepped out to give me privacy. My grandmother's handwriting was the same as I remembered it, small and precise and slightly forward-leaning, like she was always in the middle of moving toward something. She wrote that she had watched me spend my childhood trying to earn approval from a man who had decided before I was born that approval was something to be rationed rather than freely given. She wrote that she had built her own financial life quietly and separately over many decades because she had learned early that a woman with no resources of her own is a woman who cannot choose. She wrote that the money was not a fortune, but it was options. She wrote that she hoped by the time I read this I had already figured out that I was more capable than anyone in our family had given me credit for, and that the money was simply confirmation of what she had always known. She signed it with her name, and underneath in smaller letters she wrote, "I have always been proud of you." I sat in that office in Bellevue and cried for a long time. Mostly from the particular grief of being truly known by someone no longer there to see what you did with it. I incorporated Merit Creative Services 3 weeks later, named for Ethan rather than myself, a deliberate step away from the Pendleton identity. I rented a desk in a shared workspace in South Lake Union and reached out to every professional contact I genuinely respected and who I believed respected the work rather than the name attached to it. My first client was a small sustainable packaging company in Ballard that had a genuinely interesting product and no coherent way of talking about it publicly. I charged them a rate that was honest rather than inflated, and I worked harder on their account than I had worked on anything at Pendleton Developments because it was mine in a way that nothing at my father's company had ever actually been. The second client came through a referral from the first. The third from the second. I was not scaling quickly, but I was building something with a foundation that could not be revoked. Through all of it, Ethan remained a steady and slightly mysterious presence. He was gone some mornings before I woke up and some evenings later than a man running a small Georgetown contracting operation had any real reason to be. His phone calls had a specific register when they were work-related, a focused quietness, words chosen with a precision that did not match the casual simplicity of how he described what he did. One evening I came home to find him at the kitchen table with a laptop open and 3 printed documents spread out in front of him, dense columns of figures that looked nothing like construction estimates. He closed the laptop when he heard me come in, not hastily, just naturally, the way you close something you were finished with. But the documents were already in my peripheral vision, and the header on the top page had contained words I recognized from the financial press. Portfolio restructuring. Pacific Northwest Holdings. I did not ask. He had told me he would tell me everything when the time was right. I had said I trusted him. I was still holding to that. But the outline of the thing was becoming harder to ignore. Wallace called our apartment landline one afternoon while Ethan was in the shower. I answered. He was warm and unhurried and asked me to pass along that the Cascadia matter had been resolved ahead of schedule and that the board was ready to move when Ethan was. I wrote it down exactly and left the note on the counter. When Ethan read it, his expression did something I had not seen before. Quiet, complete satisfaction, the look of a person watching something they planned a long time ago finally arrive on schedule. He folded the note, put it in his pocket and said, "Good. I think it is almost time." "Almost time for what?" I asked. He looked at me with those calm dark eyes and said, "For your father to find out who he has been doing business with." 3 months after our wedding, the business news in Seattle began circling a single story with the intensity that only happens when something genuinely large is about to move. A private equity firm called Cascadia Capital Group had spent the better part of 2 years quietly acquiring minority stakes in mid-size commercial real estate development companies across the Pacific Northwest. Not hostile, not loud, just steady and methodical and below the threshold of the kind of coverage that triggers defensive reactions. The trades had picked it up first, then the local business press. And by February the speculation had reached the point where the identity of the firm's principal was the most discussed open question in Seattle's real estate and finance circles. I read the articles the way you read something that is slowly becoming familiar. Cascadia Capital Group. Discreet. Relationship-driven. A principal who had built the firm's reputation on identifying undervalued assets and overlooked partnerships. Someone who operated through intermediaries and had never given a named interview. I thought about Wallace and his unhurried telephone manner. I thought about the document header on Ethan's kitchen table. Pacific Northwest Holdings. I thought about the phrase "your father to find out who he has been doing business with." I was assembling the picture one piece at a time and the picture was becoming very clear. I did not confront Ethan directly. I'm not entirely sure why. Partly because he had asked me to trust him and I had agreed and I intended to honor that. Partly because some part of me already knew and was waiting for the moment he chose to show me rather than the moment I forced it into the open. There is a difference between those two things and it matters. What he was protecting, I was beginning to understand, was not a secret from me. It was a sequence. He had built something that was going to arrive in a specific order and he needed the order to hold. My mother called on a Thursday evening in the middle of all this. I almost did not answer, but I had been making a deliberate effort since the wedding not to make decisions based on avoidance. Her voice had the particular quality it got when she was performing distress rather than experiencing it, a slight breathiness, careful pauses in the right places. She said she was worried about me. She said my father had not been sleeping well. She said she hoped I understood that everything he had done had come from a place of love, that his methods were flawed but his intentions were about protecting the family. I listened to all of it without interrupting. Then I asked her a direct question. I asked if she had known before the wedding about the plan to flood the venue with his guests and turn the reception into a public disinheritance announcement. She was quiet for long enough that the answer was settled before she spoke. She said she had known he was going to attend and that things might get difficult. I asked her if she had said anything to discourage it. Another silence. She said, "Natalie, you know how he is when he has decided something." I told her that was not an answer. She said she had been trying to protect the peace. I told her that was also not an answer. I told her I loved her and that I needed her to understand that choosing not to act is still a choice and that I was not ready to pretend otherwise. I told her I would call when I was ready to have a different kind of conversation. Then I hung up and sat with the complicated grief of realizing that my mother was not a victim of my father's behavior. She was a participant in it who had simply found a more comfortable position to occupy. Ryan came by the Fremont apartment unannounced on a Saturday afternoon 2 weeks later. He brought coffee from a place in Capitol Hill he knew I liked and stood in our kitchen looking younger than his 26 years and more uncertain than I had seen him since we were children. He said he wanted to apologize for not doing more before the wedding, for the phone call warning me about the lawyers but not following it with anything more useful. I told him the warning had meant something regardless. He said he had been watching what our father had done since the wedding and that it had changed how he saw things. He used the word ashamed, which from Ryan, who had inherited our father's instinct toward understatement, was the equivalent of a lengthy confession. We talked for 2 hours. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had as adults, and by the end of it something had shifted between us that I suspected was permanent. The invitation arrived on a Monday. Heavy cardstock, a dark navy envelope, the kind of weight that communicates importance before you have read a single word. The Pacific Northwest Business Alliance annual dinner, held every year at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel in downtown Seattle, was the most significant gathering in the regional business calendar. Developers, financiers, tech executives, local government, everyone who mattered in the professional landscape of the Pacific Northwest in a single room for a single evening. Ethan had been given 2 seats at the lead sponsor table. He handed me the envelope across the kitchen counter and said, "I think it is time." I asked him if he was finally going to tell me everything. He said, "Better than that. I'm going to show you." The week before the dinner, Ethan sat me down on a Sunday morning and told me. Not everything, not the full layered complexity of it, but enough. He told me that Cascadia Capital Group was his. That he had founded it 11 years earlier, built it through a combination of precise early investments and a deliberate strategy of staying invisible, and that it currently held significant stakes in 14 companies across Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. He told me the contracting business in Georgetown was real. It had been how he started, how he learned the industry from the ground up, and he still went there because it kept him honest. He told me he was worth considerably more than anything my father had ever said about him. He told me he had hidden it because he had spent years being approached by people who wanted access rather than relationship, and that he needed to know with certainty that whoever he built a life with wanted him and not the balance sheet behind him. He looked at me steadily and said, "You never once asked what I was worth. Not once in 8 months. Do you know how rare that is?" I told him I was angry. Not because he had hidden it, but because I had been struggling for months, rejections and savings draining and the weight of proving myself without infrastructure, and he had been sitting beside me the entire time with resources I could not access because he had not told me they existed. He nodded and said that was fair. He said he had never interfered with my father's financial siege because he understood that the only thing that would matter to me was building something on my own terms, and that any help from him before I had done that would have poisoned the result. He said he had watched me build Merit Creative from a blank document at a kitchen table into a real client list with a real reputation, and that the version of me sitting in front of him now was different from the version he had met at the farmer's market, and the difference was entirely mine. He said he was sorry for the months that had been harder than they needed to be. He said he would spend a long time making it up to me if I would let him. I sat with everything he had told me for the rest of that day. By evening I had moved through the anger and come out the other side of it into something that felt more like understanding. He had not deceived me about who he was. He had protected a condition under which the truth about who I was could emerge without his shadow falling across it. I did not love him any differently now that I knew about Cascadia Capital Group. Which was, I realized, exactly what he had needed to know. The night of the Fairmont dinner arrived cold and clear. The kind of Seattle evening in early March where the sky goes very dark and very sharp and the city lights reflect off the water of the Sound like something deliberate. I wore a dark green dress I had bought myself with the first significant payment from Merit Creative's largest account. Ethan wore a charcoal suit I had not seen before, understated and precisely fitted, and when we walked into the Fairmont Olympic that evening something was different about how he moved through the space. The slight deliberate looseness he usually carried, the quality that made him seem like someone comfortable in the background, was gone. He moved like a man walking into a room he had been in many times on his own terms. We had been inside for less than 10 minutes when I saw my father. He was working the room near the bar with the practiced ease of a man who had attended this dinner for 15 years, greeting people by first name, laughing at the right moments, radiating the specific confidence of someone who believes he knows exactly where he stands in a given hierarchy. He had not yet seen us. A man standing beside him, someone I did not recognize, said something that made my father laugh and gesture expansively. He looked comfortable. He looked like a person who expected this evening to go the way all the others had gone. Then someone near the entrance said a name. Not loudly, but in that distinct way that important names travel through a professional room, moving from person to person in a ripple of recognition. Cascadia Capital. And then a moment later, Ethan Merritt. I watched my father's head turn. I watched him locate us across the room. I watched his expression move through recognition and then through confusion and then into something I had never seen on his face in 29 years of being his daughter. Uncertainty. Pure, unmanaged, unperformed uncertainty. Ethan looked at me and said, "Are you ready?" I told him I had been ready for months. The room at the Fairmont Olympic had the particular energy of a space where everyone present understood that something significant was unfolding, but no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge it directly. That is a very specific kind of tension, and I had grown up watching my father create it deliberately in boardrooms and dining rooms across Seattle. Feeling it directed at him for the first time was something I had not fully anticipated. It was not satisfying in the way I might have imagined during the harder months. It was quieter than that. More like watching a long equation finally balance. Ethan moved through the room with Wallace at his side, and I stayed close, watching faces shift as people connected the name to the man. The Cascadia Capital story had been building for weeks in the business press, and the principle behind it had remained unnamed until tonight. I could see the recalculation happening in real time across the faces of people who had spent the last several months carefully avoiding any association with Dominic Pendleton's disowned daughter and her nobody husband from Georgetown. One man who had declined to return my calls about a potential client referral 3 months earlier found me near the drinks table and told me warmly that he had been meaning to reach out. I told him equally warmly that I appreciated that very much and moved on. My father approached Ethan near the center of the room. I saw it happen from about 15 feet away, and I did not move closer. Some things are better witnessed from a distance. Dominic Pendleton was a man who had built an entire professional identity on never being caught without a position, and watching him navigate toward my husband with no prepared position to take was something I wanted to observe clearly. He extended his hand. His smile was practiced and immediate, the business smile, warm without being personal, confident without being aggressive. Ethan shook it. His expression was pleasant and entirely unreadable. My father said something about what a remarkable surprise this was. Ethan said he was not sure it was entirely a surprise, that these things had a way of coming together on their own schedule. My father said he hoped there were no hard feelings about the family situation, that these things were complicated, and he had always respected Ethan as a man even if the circumstances had been difficult. Ethan looked at him steadily and said that he did not have hard feelings. That hard feelings required him to have expected something different, and he had known from fairly early on exactly what kind of man my father was. He said it without any cruelty, with the same patient evenness he brought to everything, and I watched my father absorb it with the careful composure of a man who understood he was not in the dominant position for the first time in a very long conversation. Then my father did what he always did when the ground shifted. He pivoted to business. He said that Cascadia Capital's portfolio represented an extraordinary alignment of interests with Pendleton Developments, and that he would very much like to explore what a formal partnership could look like. He said the two firms together could reshape the development landscape across the entire Pacific Northwest. He said it with genuine enthusiasm, the deal enthusiasm, the version of my father that I had watched close rooms for 30 years. Ethan let him finish. Then he said he appreciated the interest and that he had actually already made a decision regarding Pendleton Developments. My father leaned forward slightly. Ethan said that Cascadia Capital had completed the acquisition of a 31% stake in Pendleton Developments that morning. The paperwork had been finalized at 9 a.m. through a series of transactions structured over the preceding 4 months through intermediary holdings. He said it the way you deliver information that is complete and not subject to discussion. My father's face went through something I did not have a name for. Not anger, not quite shock exactly. More like the specific vertigo of a man realizing that the ground he thought he owned had been purchased beneath him. He was now a minority stakeholder in his own company. My husband was his largest outside investor. The mechanic from Georgetown owned nearly a third of Pendleton Developments and had not needed to raise his voice once to make it happen. I walked over then. I had not planned the timing, but it felt right. I stood beside Ethan and looked at my father, and what I felt was not triumph. I want to be honest about that because the triumphant version of this story would be a simpler one, and this was not a simple moment. What I felt was something closer to completion. Like a chapter that had been running too long had finally found its last sentence. My father looked at me, and for the first time in my memory he did not look like a man managing a situation. He just looked tired. He asked to speak with me privately. We stepped away from the main floor into a quieter corridor off the main hall, marble floors and low light and the muffled sound of the room continuing behind us. He stood with his hands at his sides and did not reach for the business posture or the paternal authority or any of the tools I had watched him deploy my entire life. He said, "I have been trying to figure out what to say to you for 3 months." I told him he did not need to find the perfect version. He said he knew that what he had done at the wedding was unforgivable. I told him I was not interested in the word unforgivable because it closed things rather than opened them, and I was not interested in closed things. I told him what I was interested in was honesty, specifically the honest acknowledgement that the way he had raised me, the conditional approval and the managed worth and the idea that love was something you earned through strategic value, had cost me years of knowing who I actually was. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I learned to love that way because it was how I was loved." And I heard something in that sentence that I had not expected to hear. Not an excuse. An explanation offered without the usual armor around it. It did not fix anything. But it opened a door that had been sealed for as long as I could remember. The months that followed were not a reconciliation in the clean television sense. They were messier and more real than that. My father and Ethan developed a working relationship that was professional and functional, and occasionally, in moments I observed from a distance, something approaching genuinely respectful. Ethan was not interested in dismantling Pendleton Developments. He was interested in its potential under clearer leadership, a distinction my father came to understand slowly. My mother called more regularly and the calls became gradually less performative. Ryan and I had dinner every few weeks and built the sibling relationship that 30 years of our father's management style had quietly prevented. Merit Creative Services had 11 clients by the end of that year, and I was in the process of hiring my first 2 employees. The work was mine in every way that mattered. My grandmother's trust had given me the ground to stand on, and I had built the rest myself, and I knew the difference, and it meant everything. I changed the name eventually to Pendleton Creative, which surprised people who expected me to run from that name. I kept it deliberately. Not for my father. For my grandmother, who had carried that name and built something quiet and lasting inside it and left it to me as a kind of inheritance that had nothing to do with money. One evening in late autumn, Ethan and I drove out to the waterfront at Golden Gardens and sat on the seawall while the sun went down over the Olympic Mountains the way it does in Seattle, slowly and completely and without any interest in being hurried. I thought about the farmer's market on Capitol Hill and the reclaimed wood furniture stall and the 40 minutes we had spent talking about dovetail joints and how none of it had looked from the outside like the beginning of anything in particular. I thought about my grandmother's handwriting on that letter. "I have always been proud of you." I thought about the elevator doors closing on the 41st floor of the Columbia Center while my father said my name and I did not turn around. Ethan asked me what I was thinking about. I told him I was thinking about how the most important things almost never announce themselves when they arrive. He said that was true in his experience as well. I leaned against him and watched the last of the light leave the water and thought about how this, the ordinary and unhurried and completely chosen quality of this moment, was the one thing my father had never been able to manufacture or purchase or arrange into existence. You cannot build this. You can only make the decisions that allow it to find you. I had made mine. And every difficult, disorienting, occasionally devastating step of getting here had been entirely worth it. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confira Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional, real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.